There was a particular moment on a Friday evening, somewhere between 5:30 and 6, when the atmosphere in a British pub shifted. The lunchtime crowd had long gone. The cleaner had been in. The landlord had restocked the shelves and wiped down the bar and changed the barrels that needed changing, and the first of the evening regulars were coming through the door, still in their work clothes, still smelling faintly of whatever they'd spent the day doing. The room wasn't full yet. The jukebox hadn't been fed, but something had started and everyone who walked in could feel it. That version of the British pub, not a gastropub, not a themed bar, not a managed house with a branded menu and a QR code for ordering, was a specific institution with a specific culture, and it existed in its fullest form for a relatively narrow window of time. The 1970s were roughly the middle of that window. The old structures were still intact. The rooms were still divided. The beer was still pulled by hand from casks that had been brewed not far away. The landlord still lived upstairs and knew everyone who came through the door by the time they'd been coming for a month. Here is what a night out in one of those pubs actually looked like, from the moment you pushed the door open to last orders and whatever happened after. Getting there. You walked. This is the starting point that everything else depends on. In a working class neighbourhood in 1970s Britain, the pub you used was within walking distance because that was how pubs had been placed, one per street, roughly, or one per cluster of streets, calibrated to the radius a working man would walk for a drink after his shift. You didn't drive to the pub, you walked from your house to the pub, and you walked home again, which took the question of how much you drunk entirely out of the equation in terms of road safety, though not in terms of how you got up the stairs when you got home. The walk itself was part of the ritual. If you were going with someone from the street, you knocked for them on the way past. If you were going alone, the walk was the transition between the end of the working week and the beginning of whatever the weekend was going to be. 5 minutes on the pavement in the cold air, past the same houses you passed every week, and then the light from the pub windows and the sound of it coming through the door. The door. The pub door in the 1970s was usually a heavy wooden thing, sometimes with etched glass panels, always with a spring that pulled it shut behind you. The sound of it closing was the sound of the outside world being left on the other side. What hit you immediately was a combination of things that no longer exist together anywhere. Warmth from a coal fire or gas fire in the corner, the smell of beer that had been spilling and soaking into the carpet and the wood for decades, tobacco smoke already accumulating even in the early evening, and underneath all of it something else, a particular quality of human occupation that came from the same room being used for the same purpose, by the same people, for 20 or 30 years running. The interior was divided. This is what most people don't immediately remember about the 1970s pub because the divisions are gone now, knocked through in the 1980s when brewery accountants decided that one big room was more efficient than 4 small ones. But in 1975, a pub of any age had rooms. The public bar, sometimes called the tap room, was the working man's bar. Bare floorboards or lino. Dartboard on the wall. Pints a penny or two cheaper than next door. Men who had come straight from work and hadn't changed. The saloon bar was carpeted, slightly warmer in atmosphere if not always in temperature, marginally smarter. This was where you went on a Saturday if you were taking your wife out. Where you sat on a proper chair rather than a bar stool, where the conversation was slightly less loud. Between them, in many pubs, was the snug, a room small enough that 4 people filled it, with its own hatch to the bar and frosted glass that meant nobody outside could see who was in it. The snug was for people who wanted to talk and didn't want an audience. Old Harry had been in the corner of the snug since 1953. You did not sit in Old Harry's corner. The landlord. The landlord in a 1970s pub was not a manager. He was a tenant, which in many cases meant he had taken a lease on the premises from the brewery that owned the building, agreed to sell only that brewery's products, and in exchange received a living. He lived above the pub, which meant he was present in a way that no employed manager could replicate. He knew when the cellar temperature had dropped 2 degrees overnight. He knew which of his regulars was having trouble at home because he could see it in how they drank. He knew the difference between someone who came in once a month and someone who came in every night, and he treated those 2 people differently because they were different people with different relationships to his pub. His wife usually worked behind the bar, at least at weekends, and in many pubs she was the person the regulars actually talked to. She had the names of the children, the details of the holiday being planned, the knowledge of the ongoing dispute about the noise from number 22. The pub landlord and his wife functioned as a kind of informal social centre for the street, in a way that went well beyond selling drinks, and the people who came through the door understood this and used it accordingly. What you drank. The beer in a 1970s pub came in two fundamental categories that are now conflated in memory, but were distinct at the time. Cask ale, real ale, to use the term that the Campaign for Real Ale had been promoting since 4 journalists founded it in a pub on the Kerry coast in March 1971, was beer that continued to ferment in the cask after leaving the brewery and was served by hand pump at cellar temperature. It was alive in a technical sense. Its condition varied depending on how well the landlord managed his cellar, and a well-kept pint of bitter was a different thing from a badly kept one, in a way that the drinker who knew the difference could identify immediately. The big 6 breweries, Bass, Allied, Watney's, Whitbread, Courage, Scottish and Newcastle, between them controlled 75% of all beer production and owned most of the pubs in the country. They had through the 1960s been replacing cask ale with keg beer, which was filtered, pasteurised and served under gas pressure. It required less skill to keep and produce a consistent product, regardless of the landlord's cellar management. It also tasted considerably less, which was why Camera's founding in 1971 generated the response it did. By 1975, the organisation had 30,000 members. By 1979, it had 28,000 affiliated pubs in its Good Beer Guide. The campaign was one of the more successful consumer revolts of the 20th century, and it was conducted primarily from inside pubs by people with pints in their hands. Mild was still ordered in the early 1970s, particularly in the West Midlands and the North, where it had been the working man's drink for generations, lower in alcohol, slightly sweeter, cheaper than bitter. By the end of the decade, it was in serious decline. Stout was Guinness, which by 1975 was the best-selling stout in Britain by a margin that made all competitors irrelevant. Lager was arriving. Carling Black Label had been in British pubs since the 1950s, but its market share expanded dramatically through the 1970s, and by the end of the decade the lager drinker at the bar was no longer the exception. The bitter drinkers regarded this development with a suspicion they rarely bothered to conceal. A round of 4 pints and 4 bags of crisps in 1975 cost around 80p to £1. A single pint of bitter was between 20p and 25p depending on the pub and its location. The price seems low until you set it against a factory worker's take-home pay of around $40 a week, which makes that oint roughly 0.5% of the weekly wage. In 2024, the same calculation produces a figure closer to 0.7% for an average London pub pint against the median wage, measurably less affordable, contrary to what people sometimes assume. The crisps, Smith's crisps, in a white packet with a small blue twist of salt inside. This was the default crisp of the 1970s pub, and it had been since Smith's invented the format in 1920. 1 packet, plain flavour, the salting done by the customer. You shook the blue twist out, tipped the salt in, folded the top of the bag over once and shook. Golden Wonder had been making flavoured crisps since the late 1950s, and by the 1970s cheese and onion, salt and vinegar, and ready salted were all standard. Walker's wouldn't become a national brand until the 1990s. You had crisps or you didn't, and what flavour was a secondary question that the pub's particular stock answered for you. Pork scratchings hung on a card behind the bar. Peanuts came in a foil tray or were bought from a card on the wall where packets were clipped individually. The card had a picture that was progressively revealed as packets were removed, usually a woman in a swimsuit, which encouraged people to buy peanuts they didn't particularly want in order to see what came next. This was considered an acceptable marketing device in 1974. The games. Darts was not a casual activity in a 1970s pub. It was a serious one with a league structure that ran through the winter months and produced results that were followed by the teams involved with genuine attention. Every pub in the league had a board, a set of darts kept behind the bar for visitors who hadn't brought their own, and a chalk scoreboard on the wall beside the board. The oche, the line you stood behind, was marked with tape or a strip of brass screwed into the floor. On league nights, the area around the board was kept clear of other customers, not by any formal arrangement, but because everyone understood that you didn't stand in front of the dartboard when a match was on. Dominoes was the other serious game, played at tables in the public bar on specific nights, and requiring enough concentration that the table where it was happening maintained a quality of quiet that the rest of the bar didn't. Shove Ha'penny was less common by the 1970s, but still present in older pubs where the board was built into the furniture and had been used since before anyone currently drinking there had been born. The jukebox stood against the wall, usually in the public bar, and accepted 10-pence pieces that bought 3 plays. The selection in a 1970s pub jukebox was not necessarily current. It was whatever the operator had put in 3 months ago, which meant that in 1975 you might be selecting between T-Rex from 1973 and Slade from 1972, and something by Roy Orbison that had been on the machine so long nobody could remember it being installed. What the jukebox provided was volume and rhythm, and on a Friday evening when the bar was filling up and someone had put 3 coins in, the quality of the selection mattered less than the fact that there was music and the room had changed. The fruit machine, sometimes called the one-armed bandit in its earlier lever-operated form and the puggy in Scotland, stood in the corner and took coins and occasionally paid them back. The regulars had views about which machines were due a payout and which were cold, and these views were based on nothing but were held with conviction. A landlord whose fruit machine was paying out too frequently would call the operator. A landlord whose machine had gone cold for a week would also call the operator. The operator came when he felt like it. The round. Understanding how a night out in a 1970s pub worked requires understanding the round. The round was not merely a convenient system for sharing the cost of drinks. It was a social contract with obligations attached to it that were understood by everyone present and enforced by the group without anyone saying so explicitly. When you arrived and joined people you knew, you established immediately whether a round was in progress and where in that round you stood. If the round had just started, you joined it and waited for your turn. If it was nearly your round, you noted this and made your move to the bar at the appropriate moment. If you left before your round came, which was sometimes unavoidable, you said so and bought a round before you left, or you acknowledged the debt and settled it next time. Getting out of your round, disappearing when it was about to be your turn at the bar, was noted and remembered, and would be brought up lightly but definitely the next time you appeared. The round kept people together in a way that individual purchasing didn't. When everyone was buying everyone else's drinks on rotation, no one wanted to be the person who left early and broke the cycle. The drink became the pretext for remaining in company, and the company was the actual point, and the round was the mechanism that made the company stay together longer than it might have done if everyone was buying their own. The talk. What went on across those bars and in those rooms was conversation that ranged from the completely trivial to the genuinely important, and the context made it difficult to tell the difference because both kinds happened in the same place, with the same pint in your hand. You heard about jobs. The man 2 stools down knew someone at the depot who might be taking people on. You heard about houses. The Hendersons at the end of the road were selling, which meant their house would come up, which meant if you wanted to move you should speak to them before it went to an agent. You heard about marriages breaking down and parents being ill and children doing well in school, and you heard all of this because the pub was the place where information about the neighbourhood moved fastest and most freely. Working class men in the 1970s had fewer places to process what was happening in their lives than they do now. The pub was one of the places that existed for exactly this purpose. Operating under cover of normality, you were just having a drink, just talking, which made it easier than a formal occasion would have been. The man who was worried about his job or his marriage or his father's health could talk about it in the pub because talking in the pub was what you did, and the pub was where you were, and nobody had to acknowledge that anything significant was happening. Last orders. The bell went at 10:30 in most pubs, sometimes a handbell rung by the landlord himself, sometimes an electric bell that had been wired to the bar in the 1960s and had a harsh quality that cut through the noise of a full room. Last orders. You had roughly 5 minutes to get to the bar, which produced a specific surge, not a stampede, but a purposeful movement from chairs and stools toward the bar that happened every night at the same time, and that the landlord managed with the patience of someone who had done this every night for 15 years. Licensing hours in England and Wales in the 1970s were governed by the Licensing Act 1964, which permitted pubs to open 11 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, and 5:30 to 10:30 in the evening on weekdays, with some local variation. Sunday hours were shorter, noon to 2, 7 to 10:30, which was why Sunday lunchtime in the pub had a slightly compressed, more intense quality than the rest of the week. Every minute counted in a way that it didn't on a Wednesday evening. The extension of licensing hours through the Licensing Act 2003, which introduced the possibility of 24-hour licensing, did not produce the cafe culture that was promised. It produced what critics said it would produce, a different pattern of drinking rather than a more moderate one. At 11, the doors opened and the evening ended. People stood on the pavement outside for a moment in the cold, not quite ready to disperse, the conversation continuing at a lower volume in the street. Some went on somewhere, a chip shop if one was still open, someone's house with cans from the off-license. Most walked home through the same streets they'd walked from, the route familiar enough to navigate on autopilot, which was sometimes necessary. The streetlights made orange pools on the pavement. The pub windows went dark one by one as the landlord moved through the rooms, what the regulars were. The social composition of a 1970s pub is worth stopping on because it differs from the pub's reputation as a male-only space, which was partly accurate and partly not. The public bar was predominantly male and predominantly working class and made no particular effort to be otherwise. Women in the public bar were not common, and in some pubs there was a genuine social pressure against it that nobody needed to state because the atmosphere communicated it effectively enough. The lounge bar and the saloon were different. Women went to the lounge in numbers, particularly on a Friday and Saturday evening, and the presence of mixed company in these rooms was normal and expected. What was less common was a woman going to the pub alone, which attracted a specific kind of attention that made it uncomfortable enough that most women didn't do it unless they were regulars who had established their place in the room over time. By the late 1970s, this was shifting, slowly. More women were working and earning independently, and the cultural expectation that a woman's evening out happened within a specific set of contexts was loosening. The shift was faster in cities and slower in smaller towns, and in some pubs, the older ones, the ones with a particular character and a particularly established regular crowd, it barely happened at all. The age range in a 1970s pub was genuinely broad in a way that has largely been replaced by a youth-orientated bar culture on one end and a quiet retirement on the other. An 18-year-old could be at the bar next to a 65-year-old, and both were in the right place, recognised as belonging to the same institution. The 65-year-old would almost certainly have opinions about whatever the 18-year-old was drinking, and the 18-year-old would receive those opinions, and this exchange would not be considered unusual because the pub was a place where different generations met, and this was part of what it was for. Of the 75,000 pubs that existed in Britain at the beginning of the 1970s, around 30,000 have closed. The rate of closure that had been a trickle through the 1980s became a flood after the smoking ban of 2007, which was the right decision for public health and the wrong outcome for the pubs that couldn't adapt. The community locals with no food menu, no beer garden, and a regular crowd of older men who smoked and who stopped coming the night the ban came into force. What went with those pubs was not merely a place to drink. The landlord who lived upstairs and knew the street is mostly gone replaced where the pub survived by an employed manager who finishes their shift and goes home. The rooms are gone, knocked through decades ago, and the particular character that came from knowing which room you were in and why has gone with them. The round is in decline in the same way that the kind of sustained evening in a single pub is in decline, replaced by a pattern of moving between venues that the round, as a social mechanism, doesn't suit. The pub as it existed in 1975 was not a perfect institution. It excluded people. It enabled habits that caused harm. The man who was in it every night of the week was not always there for reasons that were good for him or for the people at home, but it was a place that existed at the centre of working class life in a way that nothing has replaced, and the 45,000 pubs that remain are mostly doing something different from what those pubs were doing, serving food, pivoting to a dining market, trying to survive in conditions that have changed fundamentally around them. The pub that your dad went to after work on a Friday, where the landlord knew his name and his drink and his face was known by 30 other people in the room, is in most cases gone. In some cases, the building is still there, but what was inside it, the particular combination of room and routine and relationship and beer, that is something you cannot get back once it closes. Because what made it, what it was, took 20 or 30 years to accumulate and cannot be recreated from scratch. If you remember your local, the name of it, the room you sat in, the landlord's name, what was on the jukebox, put it in the comments. Please subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive.